Hi, everyone. Welcome to this lecture on creating memorabilia. We have the lovely Kat Huang. Hello. From the Rhode Island School of Design, here to talk about her work in creating a graphic novel on antiques. And yeah, so thank you so much for coming. She's an art educator and a cartoonist, and we're so lucky to have her today. And we'll let you take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Katerina. Hello, everyone. It's very nice to meet you all, and it's an honor to be here at Stony Brook. Thank you very much for inviting me. Can everybody hear me okay? I just realized I need to project a little bit more. All right, so my name is Catherine Huang, and I go by Kat. I am an illustrator, an art director, an educator, as well as a graphic novelist. My current graphic novel is one called Nostalgia, as you can see here on this screen. And Nostalgia is a story about a child who does not know who they are or what they look like. And they find themselves in a magical antique shop. This magical antique shop is one that houses forgotten memories in the form of antiques. And this child, who I've named Kid in the story, is charged with going into this store, exploring the space, playing with the objects, and trying to pick up hints as to what their identity is and who they are. And it's a lot of drawing work. I first became interested in writing nostalgia because I have this deep fascination in antique shops. And at the time when I was starting to write nostalgia, I had no idea why I was interested in antiques. I just knew that this was something that I felt very passionate in and that I had to pursue. What I find so attractive about antique shops and flea markets is that I feel as if they are museums, but interactive museums, one where you can pick up the objects, play with them, turn them around, touch them, smell them. They smell pretty bad usually because they're all secondhand objects, and your fingers also get grimy the more you touch these objects. But I think that's all part of the fun. It's a very kinesthetic experience. And the more that I play with these antiques, the more that I touch them, the more that I look at them, the more I realize that antiques are sort of a segue to talk about stories of people. And so when I do go to antique shops, when I go to flea markets, I talk to the vendors, I talk to the shop owners, I get a good sense of who dropped off these objects, who let these objects go, who buys these objects, and who takes these objects with them into the future. And that is when I realized that really I am interested in antiques and I'm interested in objects, but truly objects are a conduit to tell stories about people. And I'm interested in people. So I realized that with a collection of objects or antiques, you can tell a story about a specific kind of person through those old objects, which made me wonder, what was the collection of old objects that people would gather up and think of me about? What is my story through old objects? And that's when I realized that I had no old objects. So my parents were born in 1960s China during the Cultural Revolution. This is a photo of my mother in China, in Shanghai. When I previously did this talk, I very confidently said, this is my child. And then I realized, oh, no, I am the child of this child. This is my mother. It was just a slip up of me talking. But anyways, my mother in Shanghai. And the Cultural Revolution was a socio-political movement that dictated the destruction of anything categorized under the four olds: old ideas, customs, cultures, and habits. And because of this movement, antiques across the country were smashed, historical sites were desecrated, and people were persecuted, particularly people who came from academic spheres. And both sets, oh, not just yet, this slide, this is actually a plaque that is being burned. And this plaque is actually one that honors teachers, one that used to hang in front of like probably a university or a community center. And people tore it down, destroyed it, burned it to sort of express their disdain for anybody in the academic spheres. And during this time, both sets of my grandparents were teachers. So they taught physics, chemistry, traditional Chinese literature, and music. And because of their professions, their belongings were particularly sought after to be destroyed. So their books were burned, their musical scores were also burned, and a lot, like a majority perhaps, of their personal effects were also in turn destroyed. And it was a very dangerous time for them. Their livelihoods were terrorized. And after all this truly left nothing for my parents in this homeland of theirs. And so they did everything they could to be able to leave and go to a place where they could carve a future for themselves, a place that had something for them. And that is the main decision why they doggedly pursued immigration. And so they ended up immigrating to the US, where I was born and raised in California. And because of all of this, I realized that whenever I see old antiques, old objects in flea markets, I feel a kinship for them because they sort of act as a surrogate for my own missing heirlooms. I realized that this was just a gaping chasm in my life, and I was only confronted with that chasm when I experienced handling antiques, and I realized my family has none because of the Cultural Revolution, because of immigration, because of personal issues as well. So because of that, I decided there was quite a great story to be had here. This is actually a sketch. So throughout this slideshow, I will be showing images of final artwork. I will be showing images of just illustrations to figure out the world. And I will also show you guys behind the scenes work, because I actually think that behind the scenes work is the crux of the work. But because of social media, because of Instagram, because of publishing, we don't normally get to see behind the scenes work. So I actually find this very helpful to put into slideshows to sort of look into, this is what went through my mind as I was creating this book. So this was a sketch that I made when I initially started thinking about nostalgia, my graphic novel. And sometimes I write things in them as well. You can read them on your own time. But when creating nostalgia, I realized that there was such an enormous set of challenges to be had here because, first of all, I had to create a universe just overflowing with objects of wonder and excitement, objects that are linked with very real histories and very real people. And in turn, the other challenge is, how do I tell a story about people that are very real, that I have to actually understand and deeply research to make sure that I am portraying these experiences in the most authentic, most genuine way possible. And I'm about to walk you through some of the ways that I was able to do that through the process of creating nostalgia. So let's go back to the very, very, very beginning, thinking about coming up with the idea. So when I was coming up with the idea, as most ideas come into fruition, it's just a bunch of things randomly floating around that you eventually start to find a pathway between. And once you pull them in, that's when you start to actually synthesize these ideas and create a fully fleshed out story with them. So I will talk about a few of the things that were floating in my mind. One was just this deep fascination in antiques generally. I made the realization about my family history much later. But one of the very, very first things for me was this store called Nostalgia. This is actually the store that my book title is based off of and is the main inspiration for the book. So Nostalgia is an antique shop that is located on Wickenden Street next to Rhode Island School of Design as well as Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. And when I was an undergraduate student at the Rhode Island School of Design, that is when I encountered my very first antique shop, which frankly was not Nostalgia. It was another small little store around. Nostalgia was the second store I found that was just enormous. Nostalgia is 3 floors, just a ground floor, a top floor, and a basement, just overflowing, overcrowded with objects of wonder and excitement. And when I went to Nostalgia, I realized I had never grew up around these objects. I have never encountered stores like these because when my parents moved to Northern California, I lived in a town called Sunnyvale, and it's very new. So there aren't a lot of antique shops. There aren't a lot of places with antiquated objects within them. So Nostalgia sort of just blew my mind, and I wanted to go there every day, which was very dangerous for my wallet. Nostalgia was also a great opportunity for me to be able to talk to different vendors because within Nostalgia, there were 200 booths. So they say booths, but really it's just a little dedicated square footage of space where each vendor would sell their wares. I would get to meet them, talk to them. The person on the right is Jim. He's actually the owner of the establishment of Nostalgia at large. So Nostalgia actually became a jumping off point when I was thinking about a story of antique shops. I decided that I should harken back to one of the very first antique shops that I ever visited, and draw a lot of visual as well as conceptual inspiration from this. So as you guys can see to the right, that's basically the storefront of my own antique shop in my book. And it's very heavily inspired by the actual shop that exists in Wickenden Street. There are some things that changed, but for the most part, I think structurally, fundamentally, it's very much inspired by this real storefront. And then eventually I had to think about who are the characters that we follow through the journey of exploring nostalgia. So I talked a little bit about Kid, who is a child that does not know who they are or what they look like. But the challenge with Kid was that they are faceless. And a lot of children, Nostalgia is a book aimed for middle grade people, so 10 to 13 years old. Children don't really connect with a character that is faceless and expressionless in that sense. So I decided that this child needed friends. And so I started creating children and characters to try to accompany Kid on their journey. So this is actually one of the very first sketches for Nostalgia. I just didn't know it at the time. The arrow is pointing at this boy that I just randomly sketched, and eventually he would become my character Vince. So these two are Vince and Fran, and these are two children who live in the shop, who help guide Kid through the shop as sort of their, not like, I guess, sidekicks, but yeah, they're sidekicks. They're sidekicks. And here are some established sketches of these characters, Fran and Vince. But in order to create a character, you need to make a very particular person. And so some things I looked at for inspiration for these kids are other kids that I have in my memory. So for instance, to the left, Fran's clothing was inspired by my niece. When I saw my niece play, I don't know, she was bowling at one point. She was still in her school uniform, but what I noticed was that she was wearing leggings under the school uniform, and I thought, hey, that could actually be kind of a cool character. One that has a school outfit but is also wearing these leggings. And to the right for Vince, I remembered when I was a middle school child, there was this boy who would always wear an oversized Sharks hoodie. Do you guys know Sharks, like the not football, ice hockey team? I'm not into sports, I'm an artist. But this boy would always wear this Sharks hoodie, and I kind of just recognized him immediately from a distance. Like, that's the boy with the oversized blue sweatshirt, that's the Sharks hoodie. And I thought, hey, he sticks out in my mind. That's actually excellent character design. So I used that hoodie and put it onto Vince, the character. I also realized in retrospect that I was also looking at other middle grade children that I found inspiration from, characters that really were iconic in my mind. So Coraline was one for Fran, and whoever follows Hunter x Hunter or Hunter Hunter. I feel like Vince is actually a combination of the Hunter Hunter characters. That's sort of something I realized in retrospect. Unlike Fran and Vince, Kid actually didn't go through that many sketch iterations because I already knew that they would be blank, but that itself was a design challenge. How do you create a relatively blank character, but still with enough physical characteristics to make them interesting? I mean, I got on this pretty fast. I just knew that they had to wear a short sleeve shirt. This sort of hairstyle would be iconic. Eventually, I got the silhouette of Kid. And this is sort of the introduction of them in the final book. Fran going, I'm Fran, who are you? I'm Vince. And the kid says, I don't know. You're supposed to help me find that out. So with sort of the setting in mind, as well as the characters that I've developed, I decided, I think I have something here that I would be able to pitch to publishers. This is sort of the arc of Nostalgia, the idea, the professional establishment of it, the publishing of it, and then eventually the creation of the art as I have to create the final book. So in order to pitch to a publisher, a lot of people create a pitch packet. So for those of you who do not know what that is, it's basically a deck of work that you just send to publishers saying, I have this idea, I have the proof that I can do it, please publish me. So essentially the pitch packet that I made was 12 images of final artwork, as well as a summary of the story. As you guys can see here, I actually blocked out the parts that are spoilers. So I guess you'll have to just buy the book and find out what the story will be about. The other thing that's really important to include in a pitch packet is just a little summary about yourself, because beyond just the work and beyond just the book, there is the author behind the book. And publishers are equally as interested as who you are as a person as they are of your work. So after I created this pitch, I actually shopped it around to agents. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. But when I was shopping around, I actually got a lot of unsolicited feedback, but it was actually very good feedback. So I'm grateful for it. The first piece of feedback I received was you need to put in comp titles. Comp titles are comparison titles. If you have a story and you want to pitch it to a publisher, you can say, this is sort of a cross between Harry Potter meets what's something like Tron or something like that. For mine, a comp title was actually Coraline, so that publishers can already get a better sense of what your story is about by pre-existing titles. The other piece of advice that I got for nostalgia was I had to color it. Essentially, it was actually a black and white story because I love black and white artwork. But then somebody said, if you're pitching this to middle grade students and you want a publisher to pick you up, you better make it as attractive as possible to a middle grade student. And the key here is color. People love it when things are colored. And I thought, great, my work just tripled. But I think it was worth it because in the end, I did manage to get a publisher on board with nostalgia, and that was Holiday House. But just for those of you who are aspiring to publish a graphic novel or aspiring to publish a book at large, I will also say that most of the times when you pitch something, the most common answer you will get is no answer. And honestly, that is the worst answer to get because you're waiting and waiting and nothing appears and you can't do anything except move on and try not to think too hard about it. If somebody replies to you and says no, that's actually a great answer because they actually acknowledged and replied to you. The fact that they acknowledged and replied means they are interested to an extent, but maybe it's just the story doesn't fit with their line of work, or maybe they just don't have the funds at the moment to be able to take on a new author, et cetera, et cetera. So you don't have to take it too personally. But eventually, after all of these trials and errors, no responses, and a lot of no's, you will get a yes. And you just need one yes for something to come through. Excuse me. Something else I wanted to say, when I was pitching nostalgia, there were a lot of editors who were interested, but they thought that nostalgia was going to be too complex for a middle grade reader. And I was like, I mean, that's fair from your standpoint as a business, but I don't believe that. I feel like a lot of middle grade readers, as well as just children, are precocious and are able to create and tell and consume stories that we might not actually expect them to. So really what you want to do is put out stories of a wide variety. You want to have potential. You want to put it out there for somebody to actually read it and pick it up. But anyways, I got editors who were interested, but at a business level, they just didn't want to take nostalgia. And I thought that's fine and fair. I'll find somebody who is interested. I'll find somebody who would give me that yes. So that's something that I also encountered. Eventually, it did get into the publishing marketplace, and I got the deal report, as you can see here. But the next thing, and this is a little bit out of order, is I wanted to find an agent. So for those of you guys who do not know this, an agent basically represents you when going to publishing deals or professional settings, etc. An agent protects you because I did not study how to create a contract. I did not study all of this. I study how you create a story, how you write it, how you illustrate it, and that's already an enormous amount of my time. So I wanted to create an opportunity for nostalgia to be represented also by an agent who knew what they were doing and could protect me in the process. And in the end, I settled with Aisha Pandey Literary. And something that I found really striking about Aisha Pandey is on the front page, they say pretty immediately that they are on an anti-racist mission to champion underrepresented voices in publishing. And I thought, I also agree with this sentiment, and I feel like we can have a good relationship because of this. And I think that my relationship with Kayla has really exponentially, well, has greatly informed the way I also write nostalgia because I have somebody on board, somebody I can always reference, somebody who's on my team to help me create and therefore pitch and then sell nostalgia. So I've gone through a lot of the professional activities of nostalgia. I will now put that aside, and now I will talk about the creative side of creating nostalgia. So after I did the pitch, after I got the book deal, I was then allotted a certain amount of time to be able to write the full story as well as draw the full story. So how do you write a story? again, I think it's all about finding these little things floating in the air that you're interested in and finding the pathways between them. So when I originally started writing, I just word vomit on a page. I write every single thing possible and I draw every single thing possible that just comes to my mind. And sometimes you write things that are totally nonsensical. At first, I thought that nostalgia would be a store where silhouetted customers would come and go and basically ask for something that nostalgia does not provide, such as this man on the right saying, "Can I order some food?" And Vince is like, "We're not a restaurant. We are an antiques shop." So in retrospect, this is so silly. It did not make it in the book. But what was important was that I put it down onto paper, because I think if I didn't put it down onto paper and I just self-edited it and just deleted it off in my mind and not even considered it, I feel like I would have limited my own potential, because I can't just delete things off in my mind. I need to put them down and consider them before I go forward or not go forward with it. So that's actually something I tell my students all the time. You need to not self-edit. You need to not limit your own potential. You need to put it down on paper and then decide. Sometimes I write really cryptic things. So I feel like on the left, it almost feels like a slam poetry sort of thing, like forget your sorrow and think about them. And when they awaken, accept them as they are. It's sort of nonsensical. I'm just writing things that come into my mind, anything at all that floats in, and I just write them down somewhere. And then I decide if they are useful to take into the story or not. And something among all of this sort of gibberish is the bottom right, which is forgotten things don't disappear. And I felt like that was something I could actually latch onto and create a story around. That is why nostalgia is full of antiques that represent forgotten memories, because forgotten things never truly disappear. Forgotten things just live on in different ways. At times, I don't understand what I wrote, as is the case here. I'll end up somewhere. Well, I guess you'll end up somewhere. Or something like this. Sometimes I just need to get a scene down really fast. And I say that I am a professional illustrator. I'm an art director. I teach at RISD. But then I draw something like this and I think, but again, you need to not self-edit your potential. You just need to put it down onto paper and then consider what is going to happen. Sometimes it's really hard to get my thoughts down onto paper, especially in writing. So sometimes I have to doodle something really fast, draw something really fast. And at times I can't even express what it is that I feel. I just feel like I need to draw some sort of emotion. And I found this in my notes, and this also did not make it into the final book for nostalgia, but I felt like there was a lot of emotional depth in a simple illustration such as this. I don't exactly remember my mindset when I was drawing this, but my understanding is the left scribble is sort of the true emotion, but the right image is a reveal, but it is not the true emotion. And I just felt like I needed to draw this and understand this emotion to be able to write about it, draw it further in nostalgia. And sometimes I just like to have fun. So in nostalgia, there's like a whole host of colorful, beautiful characters and creatures. And one of my favorite things about making nostalgia is actually reinventing lives for toys. I really like seeing a toy in an antique shop and thinking, oh, you would run a certain way, you would fall over, or you would play in a certain way. So toys come to life a lot in nostalgia. And in this case, one toy says, "Mer, mer, 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 mer." And then the other toy has to translate saying, she has no opposable thumbs. I don't know what I was thinking. And again, sometimes you have some very cryptic writing. Forgotten things come back in unexpected ways, which is a little bit different from forgotten things live on in different ways. I cannot zoom in on this because it is full of spoilers, but these are the thumbnails that I created for the first 2/3 of the book. Yeah, 2/3 of the book. 2/3? 1/3, sorry, 1/3 of the book. This is just sort of a collection of, basically, I have to send thumbnail sketches to my editor for her to read through them, understand the story, and approve them before I move on to the final art. I have zoomed in a little bit. This is the extent that a thumbnail can portray, just enough to tell the story, just enough to decipher who is here and what is happening. This is not the final art, but this is actually a really important part of the process. Something I also teach my students is it is a skill to be able to thumbnail something. You have to utilize your time and your resources wisely in order to get the project done. And in this case, I can't be drawing full-on illustrations. That would be a waste of my time if my editor disapproved of that part of the story. You have to learn how to create something a little bit midway through to present to your editor and eventually get approved to make your final art. I bring this up because I want to talk about it in two capacities. The first capacity is nostalgia cannot be shown fully because it's full of spoilers and the book is not out yet. So that's why I want to pull this up. The second reason why I wanted to pull this up is to be able to create a large form project such as a graphic novel, you need to learn the skill of finishing something first. So this is a comic I created called Mama Bruja. Mama Bruja is published by Penguins Literary Magazine, and because it's a literary magazine, it's just 18 pages long. It's just a submission to this magazine. But what I found really valuable about Mama Bruja is to understand the creation and writing process of an entire finished story. So when I created Mama Bruja, wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. Maybe I should explain what Mama Bruja is about. Mama Bruja is a comic about a Mexican-American girl who goes back to live with her abuelita after not seeing her for many, many years. And it tackles issues of diaspora, of not fitting in, of coming back to your roots, but not quite understanding what those roots are. So something that I did for a story like this is I am not a Mexican-American person. I actually had to talk to a lot of people with whom this is a very real experience. So on the very first page of Mama Bruja is actually this acknowledgement saying, thank you very much to this list of people who I interviewed so I could better understand this very real experience. But with Mama Bruja, it was a toned down miniature version of what would eventually become my process to create an entire book. So Mama Bruja, I think, was one of the most key steps I could do in order to create nostalgia eventually. I just didn't know it at the time. So I would create, as I showed previously, just sketches and random scribbles. Eventually, I started to build the world in my mind and also on paper. So this is actually a floor plan of the house that the main character lives in. Don't look at it too closely. Is anyone here an architect, designer? And this was also me practicing how you thumbnail something. I would create thumbnails in my little sketchbook with just like an HB pencil very quickly on the train, in the car, just randomly on the side. But these eventually would become more and more informed as I tried to edit down, take away, and add more sketches. And as the thumbnail started to come into fruition, I started to write more of a script. So I understood fully what the dialogue was between the characters. I think what's really difficult about comics is that you're balancing not only imagery and storytelling through images, but it's a huge chunk of writing as well. You cannot have one without the other. So that's why I had to create this script. And the reason why I can show you this is Mama Bruja is already published. I don't mind spoiling it. I cannot show you the script for nostalgia. Something else that was really important, though, about Mama Bruja is that it does incorporate Spanish, and it was very important to me that the Spanish was correct as well. So that's why I had to write it down to fully understand and see it. So with all of these in mind, all of the parts are starting to synthesize into one final comic form. I wanted to show you guys a step-by-step process of thumbnail to sketch to final artwork. Mama Bruja is a black and white comic. It is not colored. I'll show you color later with later images and nostalgia. But I want to point you guys to the image on the far left. That is a thumbnail. It stays pretty loyal to the sketch and pretty loyal to the final artwork. But there is this part here on the bottom where I realized, ooh, I feel like the timing doesn't feel right. The breakup of the space doesn't allow me to read it with the emphasis I want people to understand the story with. So instead of 2 panels, I just quickly scribbled it out and said, no, just 3 panels. I think 3 panels is the right beat for this story. And eventually the 3 panels made it into the sketch and into the final image. That took me like 10 seconds max. But that was an essential part in creating the final story. So again, do not self-edit your potential. Put it down onto paper to understand it. And of course, this is the final comic in the end. I did print out zines because I gave these zines to the people I interviewed, but the true final format was a digital, like literary magazine. But essentially with Mama Bruja, I finished something. And I think a lot of people make the mistake of taking on a project that is far too large for them and then having to give up because they haven't understood the skill to take it all the way to finish. So you have to take it as it comes. You have to start with bite-sized pieces before you start to get into a whole entire realized piece. With that writing portion done, I also wanted to create the art eventually. This is sort of what every illustrator is looking forward to. I have a fun little story about nostalgia. One of the things that was floating in my mind that I eventually roped into nostalgia was something a professor said to me while I was a student. And she said, your work isn't so much about the artwork and the style as it is about content, which is a compliment. But I was also a little bit taken aback thinking, well, I am an artist and I still like to draw things and I love to make lovely images as well. Of course, I'm a writer, a storyteller, but I also want to create beautiful images. I am an artist. And so nostalgia was at one hand a writing challenge, but it is also a drawing challenge. How do you create rooms that are overflowing with objects of wonder? How do you create all these different kinds of objects, understand them, and be able to put them in a space and have narrative significance? How do you build space beyond the objects? Because although you have all these wonderful antiques, they need to live in a world that makes sense for them. The world must be as well designed as the characters and the objects are as well. And I just wanted to show this image of close-ups of different objects because another challenge I got with nostalgia is sometimes it gets overwhelming. There are too many characters and too many objects at play. How do you sort of strike this balance of creating a filled up world, but one that is riveting in composition, one that people can feel they can sink into and understand the story? And I'm about to walk you through how to do it. You do research. You do a lot of research. Which is great because I love visiting antique shops anyways. If I'm with friends or if I'm with family, I'd say, oh, I need to pop into this antique shop. It's for research. I'm not shopping, I'm researching, which I really am. And I think one of the best things you could do about having a job that is your passion is you can do both at the same time and it's fun for you. So I would go to antique shops anytime I saw them and I would take so many pictures. I've been to antique shops from the West Coast to the East Coast to in the middle in the US. I've also been to antique shops abroad when I'm able to travel abroad. And whenever I can, I try to talk to the people who are in the spaces. Sometimes they don't want to be talked to, and I'm like, that's fine, it's okay, I'll just look at objects. And I take a lot of photos. But beyond just visiting antique shops in person, I would also go online and search a specific kind of, I see people grinning in the back. Yeah, so antique bookends, Etsy. Is anybody else an Etsy addict? Yes, all right. It's actually really dangerous. I know that in your phone, there's a little setting where you can see how much time you spent in each app. And for me, the Etsy app is extremely dangerous. Like the bar is extremely high. But I think what's really fun about finding things online is that you can curate your search a lot more. When you go to an antique shop, you're kind of beholden to the collection that is there. But if you search online, you can find a particular thing, such as an antique frog or an antique bookend, if you're illustrating a library scene. What do I do with all of these images? I compile them into massive mood boards. So what I think really helped me was also to categorize each of my images into folders on my computer saying, this is a J&S Antiques Mall, or this is from Nostalgia in Providence, or this is the Stuff store. There's a store called Stuff in San Francisco that I would put those photos in. And then I have another folder saying, this is my internet folder. And in there I have toys, furniture, clothing, jewelry, and then I start to organize all of these things. Although it feels like a massive thing to do, which it really does feel like that, I think that work really pays off in the end when I'm creating the illustrations and I can easily find a bookend, a toy, a piece of furniture, and then be able to compile mood boards like this. I would also compile mood boards specific to the part of the story that I'm illustrating. So one of the first chapters in Nostalgia, the children go to a library or the bookstore part of the shop. And I compiled these images as saying, this is sort of the vibe that I want the library to be in. And one of the libraries I found a lot of inspiration from was the Biblioteca Joanina in Portugal, which is, I think, the oldest university library ever. Also, fun fact, they raise bats and release those bats into the libraries to eat the pests that would destroy the books. Pretty cool, right? So for an illustration such as this, I compile a mood board that is exactly like that. And I'm about to walk you through how I'm able to use these photos in the illustration. Sometimes I copy it pretty exactly. I think that the gesture of the frog with the basket is pretty exact. I also think that the squatting and the shape of the frog on the bottom is also pretty exact. But this is what's really important about using references and reference photos. It's important to interpret the photo. You cannot copy the photo. If you copy the photo, you might as well just have the photo. Why even go through the effort of illustrating it? But when you interpret that photo, take the information that you need and put it into the world that you want it to live in, that's where the artistry begins as an illustrator. So also, I just made him a basket just because I can make him a basket. Or something like this, a casual little like metal chicken thing I saw in a vitrine can eventually become a fun chicken friend for the characters. But it had such a dreary gray color, I just made it more colorful. That's sort of my interpretation of it. Or something like this, just put them in. Another easy thing I do is just flip the image sometimes just to make them face different directions. I find that creating these objects really required me to do a lot of outside research. I actually do think it's egotistical for an artist to think, oh, I can make up everything. I can think of it and I can draw it. Like, sure, you can do that to an extent, but you're just one person. And this world is so full of inspiration, so full of options, so full of potential that I think you would be remiss to ignore all of that in the favor of your own voice. I think part of being an artist is understanding the voices around you, understanding the voices around the world, and seeing in turn how you can transform, interpret, create based on this information. Nostalgia is completely hand-drawn with traditional media. It is not a digital drawing. It's digitally colored. I'll get to that soon. But here are the materials. This is my studio space. Yeah, it's my studio space. And basically how I create a comic page is I would have a piece of Bristol paper and I would measure out the panels. So what I find actually really interesting about panel work is that you can tell if it feels too random. As you flip through the page, you're like, wow, this artist didn't consider the panels whatsoever. It's really important to be able to organize your images on the page. So a good chunk of time is actually spent measuring out some panels and knowing how it would look and knowing how it would be consistent through the book. And then with my dinky little pencil, I just sketch the images in. And then in the end, something like this would appear. I don't know if you guys can see that, but on the left-hand side, all of these pages are pretty finished in terms of sketch. But on the right-hand side, I still have yet to finish them. A lot of panels are blank. These are the materials I use to actually create the final artwork. So I use Higgins Blackmagic ink. Does not come out of clothing, be careful. And I also use a traditional dip pen. So I have like this metal nib, it comes to a point, and then if you press hard on it, it would spread out like this. So you can have a line width that varies. I bought this foam holder on Amazon. I get so many questions about this foam holder. It's so easy to find, just go on Amazon, find it. And something else I want to point out as like a fun little tidbit is this piece of paper towel. I still have it and I've been using it for half a year and I just keep finding new real estate to just wipe my pen on it. Like I refuse to get a new piece of paper towel. This is the one I'm going to take to my grave. And yes, it's a very physically demanding medium. So I have to like sit there and draw for a while and I have to have a lot of great precision when it comes to a drawing tool like this. So something that's really important is knowing how to take breaks. When I feel like my hands are being strained, I try to get up and walk around. Maybe this is TMI. Okay. I also drink like lots of water and tea. it's great to be hydrated, but also it's good to have a physical reminder that you need to go and leave and walk somewhere. For any big parts of black, I actually just use a paintbrush and just paint those in black. If I make any mistakes with the ink, I use white gouache to cover that up. With the traditional artwork of any illustration, what's really funny about illustration is it's actually pretty rare to see the original artwork. Usually for an illustration, you see the reproduction of it. So even if I make mistakes on this paper and I just slap on some white gouache to cover it, it's okay because I can digitally edit that and it will print in the book and people will see the reproduction. And in the end, that's what I care about, that I get a finished book. With a drawing tool such as dip pen and ink, that's actually a pretty standard tool for a lot of comics artists. A lot of people, it comes from like many years of traditional like comic making. Nowadays, comics are being made with like paint and other drawing mediums and digitally particularly. But the reason why I keep coming back to this dip pen and ink is that I feel like I can get such a material presence with the ink. I'm able to create such a delicate and fragile line with this sort of nib that sometimes is unexpected. Sometimes I have to let the medium speak for itself, which is not something I get all the time with digital work. And I teach digital illustration. I teach digital art. I understand this. There are pros and cons to everything. And of course, I can't do it without my assistant. Her name is Mia. All right. Once this drawing is done, I have to erase away the pencil marks. I scan it in and I digitally retouch it. So it's like stark black and white. And that is when I digitally add color. The reason why I digitally add color to nostalgia is honestly just the time commitment. It is faster to do things digitally. And with all the time put into the physical drawing of it, I need to just slap on color at that point to get it to the publisher. But I do want to note that even though I do create these images colored digitally, I still try to make a traditional colored study, because what I find really informative about the color choices I use is actually the process of creating those colors. I need to mix blue and red to make purple. I need to understand this process comprehensively to understand why I even need to choose this color. If you're just working digitally, you would just go to the color picker and pick purple. You would not go through the process of mixing the color. I think having a comprehensive understanding of your subject matter and your drawing material can open up your ideas for a wider range of potential. And so that you can also comprehensively understand all the subject matters you're dealing with and create something that is more specific. Here's another example. Sometimes I like to cross mediums. So the left side is actually a digital sketch, and then the right side is a traditional drawing. So again, pros and cons to every medium. And finally, we can look at a few behind the scenes pieces for the nostalgia comic. So the left is the dinky little pencil sketch. The right is the inked image. And then eventually it becomes colored like so. These are illustrations I had to make for the pitch for nostalgia. So when I pitched this book to publishers, I had to give people a sense of the world that the children were going to explore. So in this case, we see the toy room, we see the clothing boutique. But I mean, that aside, I think that when you create a comic, so much of it is just meditative work. A lot of it is just grunt work. You have to sit there and you have to draw. You have to put your butt in your chair and draw for hours and hours and hours. And it's very meditative work. You get to listen to a lot of podcasts, you get to listen to a lot of music, but you also get to think a lot about your own story, dwell with it, linger with it, make friends with it. And I think through this process, that is how I came to the conclusion of, wow, I think nostalgia speaks to the fact that I have no antiques. That was a realization that I made while creating the artwork for nostalgia. But it also opened the doors for other ideas. I think nostalgia is a story that studies legacy. What does it mean to inherit something, whether that be an object, an idea, or inheriting a trauma? I think the disastrous effects of the Cultural Revolution linger in me today. There are very few family photographs. Some of them I put in the very beginning of the presentation. There aren't very many of them. And so how do you sit with this fact and how do you create a story from this? I think something else that is a very powerful thing for an artist to do is to transform things. So with this inherited idea, with this inherited trauma, what am I going to do about it? I'm going to try to make a story out of it. I'm going to try to be my authentic self, my authentic own storyteller. I think what is so attractive about comic making to me and to a lot of people is autonomy. Because when you are a comics artist, you are everything at once. You are the writer, you are the artist, you're the art director, you're the prop designer, you're the lighting master, you're the stage director. You are all of these things when it comes to being a comics artist. So you can practically make a feature film entirely with your hand. And I think that's what makes comics so powerful. It truly is autonomy. Cycling through a lot of images of nostalgia. I didn't realize how many slides I put in here. This is a library scene, dinky little sketch, and up to the final artwork of nostalgia. Several pages. I think through comic making, I've been able to create stories that unlock lots of parts of me. So usually when I tell people that, I am as much of a viewer of my own stories as any of you all, because I unconsciously put things in these stories that I only realize once I look at it retroactively. When I read it later, I thought, wow, this was in me this entire time. And this has come out in the form of this story or this comic. And I think that's the reason why I keep getting drawn back into making comics, because I think this is meditative work where I discover myself in it. But it's also a tricky balance of why would you create art if not to be viewed by other people? So this is as an most authentic version of me expressing myself, but I must also consider you all. I must also consider the viewers. How does one create a story that is their authentic self, but also be able to reach and touch people around them? And I think a big part of it is just finding your own community. Again, I got a lot of radio silence and a lot of rejection when it came to nostalgia. A lot of people actually considered that nostalgia might have been too advanced for certain readers, but eventually I did find that person that said yes. And that really is all that matters. You just need that one yes, and you need to be seen. And you cannot be seen if you don't put yourself out there. And I feel like comic making is my version of putting myself out there. Nostalgia is about many things. Nostalgia is about grief. Nostalgia is about loss. Nostalgia is about ruminating about the past, but nostalgia isn't just about ruminating in the past. Nostalgia is a story about carving a way into the future. Nostalgia is about joy and play. Nostalgia is about love. It's so many things. I think a lot of those things also are modular. They can translate over to different areas of your life. And this is everything I've learned in nostalgia is in turn things I teach currently. I am an assistant professor in the Rhode Island School of Design in the illustration department, where I teach drawing classes, I teach painting classes, and I teach story writing classes and concepts classes, basically the ideas behind images. How can you create a certain image and make sure that you are communicating a certain idea? How do you change people's perceptions through illustration work? And everything that I've learned in nostalgia has in turn informed the way that I also teach. How do you communicate? How do you express yourself? And how do you encourage and uplift the voices around you? And again, nostalgia is not about ruminating in the past. Nostalgia is about carving a way into the future. And my legacy will be one of reclamation and survival of my cultural identity. And through the creation of nostalgia, as well as my teaching work, I hope to help others carve their own legacies. Thank you. That is. All right. So another little part of this talk is I wanted to give you guys a very brief drawing demonstration of how I even build up a comic page in nostalgia. And you guys will see everything on my iPad and see everything in my Procreate app. But I wanted to show this really fast. So this was actually, I did this like really fast last night where I combed through my phone and I actually selected all the images that I took specifically because they would make good reference photos for nostalgia. These photos have not yet been used in the final nostalgia book. These are recent photos, but I compiled them all into this mood board like so. And each image is their own little layer. But basically, a lot of nostalgia starts off with this, a mood board, just a general chart of things I'm interested in. Like, what is that? I think something else I find so fun about antique shops is you kind of wonder, like, what kind of person would have that? What kind of person would buy that? What kind of person made that? But beyond just objects, I also try to accrue images of spaces as well. So this is sort of like a carnival thing. I get photos from everywhere. I take my own, I find them on the internet. I also screenshot them off of people's Instagrams. So this is actually screenshot off of somebody's Instagram story that I follow. So I figured that this would actually be a really good setting for this demo. So it starts off with a mood board. I have an image like this. Procreate has this really great function to have a reference window. So I can take a look at my references as I go through here. And I guess I will talk a little bit, draw a little bit, and eventually I would like to invite somebody onto this stage to have a conversation with. Give me 1 second as I connect this. Of course. Hi, Susie. Thank you for joining me today. Yeah, that sounds good.
So I know Kat from RISD. We talked together
Yes.
last summer. So I'm thrilled that she's able to make it here today. And I started listing questions as you were speaking.
All right.
So my first question is, so you talked a little bit about material and the tools that you use.
Yeah.
I know so I've been following some artists for a long while. I think Paul Pope was one of those people that actually changed or developed like a kind of unique style where he was really interested in like the brush and ink style of Japan, and I know that he had studied in Japan for a little while. So he started to make panels that were just almost like they look kind of like sume ink-ish. So I'm wondering if you with your nib and your ink, if you're curious about like exploring other types of styles, other ways of painting.
So through material or through literal drawing style?
Material and drawing style.
Yeah, I think that experimentation is really important. I think at this point in my career, though, right now, because I have to finish nostalgia, I kind of thought, okay, well, I just have to do pen and ink and then digital coloring. So for the sake of this project, I have to do this. But I also kind of, because artists have to make a living too. I think that with every project or commission I get, I also try to make it a learning opportunity for myself. So actually, this is random, but I have it here. I was commissioned to create this like bat illustration, and you can see it here. This is my digital sketch, but I'm using this as sort of an opportunity to say I would love to do scratchboard artwork. So do you guys know what scratchboard is? It's basically like a black panel, and you take a knife and scratch away, and with every scratch you make a white mark because you scratch away the black. And so it's very a lot of drawing is additive. Like right now I'm adding black, right, to this canvas. But with scratchboard is reductive. You take away the material, and that's another interesting process of drawing. So yes, I think experimentation is great. I think I have limited time. So I try to also, with every professional opportunity, make it an opportunity to learn. That was a very long answer. All good. Thank you, Susie, for your answer. Of course.
So you talked about style too. Do you find that you have, or you're developing a unique style, or do you feel that you can kind of, I guess, explore, as you had mentioned?
Do I have a unique style? Ooh.
They're known for like one thing, and that becomes their signature style and a signature look.
Yeah. I think what's interesting about style is that is just how you draw. Ultimately, the way you draw is there's some sense of your own identity in it. So I would say like the way I draw just is my style. And I do try to play around, like I play with shape language. I try to use different colors or try to use different mediums, but in the end, it did come from me. And so there is sort of inevitably me in it. I think also style is such a hodgepodge of things you've gathered in your life, such as like your own interests. Would you say nostalgia is a style? I don't know. I think the subject matter is very not common. It's consistent, right? Eclectic objects throughout the book. Some people don't like drawing objects. That's fine. It's good to know how to draw it, but to choose to draw it all the time, you don't have to choose to do that. Some people like to draw spaces. Some people like to draw people. I would say subject matter is like indicative of personal choice and therefore also style. So do I experiment? I try to, but it does just come from me in the end. Oop. I'm sort of like drawing this merry-go-round scene. I think this looks kind of bland though. I'm going to do it from a different point of view. So again, see, like this did not take me very long. This is just for me to figure out generally what I want. Here's the other thing. When you guys draw a thumbnail, the first thing you must draw is this square. Why is that? Should I answer my own question? With digital, it's actually pretty flexible, but especially when you're drawing traditionally, what if you say, oh, I like this thumbnail, but I wish it was a horizontal format? Easy, just draw another square around it and say, oh, okay, I can draw more of the scene like that. So actually playing with the edge is like an incredibly important part of composing a piece and an incredibly part of composing a comic because it's all panels. It's all has to fit on a page too. All right, as I keep drawing this, we can take more questions from other people if anybody else wants to hop on. Thank you, Susie.
So, what inspired you actually to take on art? Because right now, I'm actually in the predicament of doing medical illustration or graphic design.
Oh, it's really cool. What do you call it?
Yours, yeah, full majors. I mean, I chose art because that was the one I felt like I excelled in, honestly, because I mean, we all went through classes at high school, like math classes, literature classes, science classes, blah, blah, blah. And although like I could do all of these things, I felt passionate in, I felt the best, honestly, in artwork. I felt like this was something that I could truly excel in, and that was sort of my own instinct to pursue this. I think having Asian American, East Asian parents, that's a really difficult path to go down. But I think my parents also recognized to a certain point that this was something I could not only do well at, but just be really, really good at, something I was truly passionate in to pursue. But I will say for you, no matter what path you take, you're going to learn something from it. And also, your life is not going to be dictated by the one thing you study. You have so much more life to live. You can pivot, you can do other things. I think something that is perpetuated in art school, because I went to an art school and I teach at an art school, is this unfortunate feeling that you're, quote, a failure, unquote, if you don't have a profession in art when you graduate. But the reality is, why even bother? You need to make a living. So you can do things that are not art related after art school, and that's perfectly fine. You can be good at something not art related after art school. So that's something I often tell people, especially when they're near graduation. But again, I mean, to summarize, I can't make that decision for you. That's your decision to make. And that's hard to have the power of choice. But no matter what you go into, you're going to learn something from it, and you will have the autonomy to pivot if that is something you decide. Does that answer your question? Thank you for your question.
Good question. I've actually also been graphic designer for the university. I actually experienced like burnout. How do you handle burnout as an artist?
What I feel like is burning me out. There are stints where I don't touch nostalgia for like a week or so, which don't tell my editor that. But I think that taking breaks is also a very powerful thing you could do. I have something related to that. Oh yeah. So who is the author who made like the Eat, Pray, Love book? Do you guys know that author? Yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay, yes,
Yeah.
yes, okay. But she had a TED talk that like really made an impression on me, where she said that she believed that inspiration was a ghost that just possesses you, and then that is how you create. And I think that's so wonderful on two fronts. One front is if you make it huge and make it big, it kind of keeps you humble because you say, oh, like I did this amazing thing, but actually that was also like my creative ghost. It's also them. But also it's a catch-all if you really bomb it and fail. You can say, well, it wasn't really me. It was also like my ghost. So that's pretty nice to think about. But something I was thinking about particularly with this like ghost of creation when making nostalgia is that I want to be a hospitable host. I want to be open to like the art of creative possession. And I think that taking care of myself makes me a more hospitable host for creation to come. So I kind of try to frame self-care and taking breaks and taking time after burnout as empowering. It is the most empowering thing I can do to care for myself. Thank you for your question. Mhm.
A question.
Oh, yeah. You got, okay, keep coming.
What is your one advice that has like stuck with you or like you could give to us?
Oh, at large? Oh, okay. That your voice matters no matter where you go. And I think everyone's voice matters. Something else I think is that you cannot give anybody a voice, but what you can give is accessibility to tools and spaces for people to project their own voice and sort of recognizing how do you project your own voice, but also how do you uplift the ones around you. So I guess the general advice is your voice matters. Do you have another question? Okay.
We have a Zoom question from Janet Clark. Thank you for sharing the process of writing, drawing, and publishing. Nostalgia sounds like a great book. What is it about the young reader audience that draws you to create for them?
Well, I just think back to stories that really
And influenced me. And a lot of it did come from childhood during middle grade slash like maybe not below the age of 7, but like 7, 8, 8, 9, 10 to like middle school age. I think a lot of things inspired me at that time and continue to inspire me. So really, I was looking at the most pivotal age for myself. And I thought, well, what would I want to make for middle school Catherine, right? Middle school Cat. So that is a factor of making the story for middle grade, which I do believe. I think also it is important to nostalgia is an incredibly personal project, but it is also something I eventually have to pitch and publish in the end and to sell. So something that is viable to consider is who your audience would be. And I think also right now, middle grade comics are very popular. So that's another reason why I decided to make it middle grade is of course I want to make my own story, but I do want it to sell as well. So that was two reasons why I chose like the middle grade audience.
That's a very impressionable age. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I think I like this thumbnail right here because I feel like it's got a lot of drama. This one was very straight on and it was a little bit boring. I think this one, if it was a carousel, it would be hard to see the animal here. And this was like from a bird's eye view. But this one from a worm's eye view, I think it would be a cool like confrontation with like whatever animal I decide to choose here. All right, I'm gonna go with this and I'm gonna make a more finished sketch. Are there any more questions?
So what comics or graphic novels were important to you growing up?
Being from an East Asian community, a lot of manga. Wow. Why are you laughing? It's true. But I think what's really incredible about manga is like the sheer amount of it. And frankly, oh man, is this being recorded? A lot of manga is pirated. So as like a middle school kid, it was very easy to get your hands on like free pirated manga, whereas it was not as easy to get your hands on free pirated like American titles. So because of accessibility and exposure, I think manga has been. And if I were to name a few, like Full Metal Alchemist is awesome, Hunter x Hunter, which I showed. Um, yeah, those are some good titles. Any other comics? Like I can only think about one thing at once. So right now I'm thinking about manga, but another title, I mean, books and films generally. I think that a really good film that inspired me was the Monkey King series that came out around like 1960s. Well, the very beginning of the Cultural Revolution. And then as the Cultural Revolution progressed, those movies were banned, which I think was such a huge setback for the animation world in China because the Monkey King animations were like groundbreaking, beautifully animated films. Um, yeah, and I think those films also really inspired me. The Monkey King, I think it was like the third film. It was like the fight against the skeleton witch, Bai Guqing, if anyone's curious the name. She was like, she's still a person I use to teach about character design because the Bai Guqing is someone who can transform into different, like shapeshift into different characters. And as like her witch form, she's like this powerful, like posture, shape language, extremely menacing character. But the instant like she transforms into like an old man, or the instant she transforms into a young, beautiful woman, not only does some of the shape change, but the posture changes as well. The way she speaks, the way she acts, which I think is a very key thing for character design. People think character design is, oh, fancy clothing and a cool character with a gun. But in actuality, character design is how do you make a person? How do you create a person? Which is so much more complex than just fancy clothes and weapons, right? That was such a long-winded answer. I'm sorry. Manga, films, yeah, books that I was inspired by as well. Oh, hello.
Yeah, I was gonna introduce me as a fellow comic book artist, but yes, thanks. So my question is not related to making the comic specifically or like making it as a comic book artist, but you said you like to research and you went to antique shops and talked to people. Which was the most curious story you heard about an object at a store? I would love to know if and how it was incorporated in your book, but I don't want you to spoil the book, of course, but I'm curious about like, what kind of story did you hear about?
Mm, So definitely not one that made it into my book, but it was just interesting to know. I came across a cabinet of fine jewelry, and somebody pointed out like, "Oh my gosh, there's a bear claw bracelet in there." I thought, "Oh, okay, cool. A claw of a bear. That's interesting." But then they went on to say, "Oh no, it's not just any bear claw. Like at a certain point in time, bear claw jewelry was banned." Because the poaching of bears was such a huge problem to get their claws, to get, the resources from the bear's body, that they actually banned it altogether. So the fact that we see this bear claw bracelet in this window means that this bracelet came from a specific point in time. But not only that, it also tells us that the curator of this booth really understands jewelry. If they even acquired a bear claw bracelet and recognized it for what it was. That was like the first thing that came to my mind. Is there anything else? Why do I make my job hard? I answered your question right. Again, why do I make my job hard? See, I thought that was a funny image I saw was like there was like a fraternity paddle I saw one time. But what I found really interesting was that on the back they had carved all the dates. And I was like, does this go back like 70 years? That's crazy that they carved all these years on it. But also to your sort of question of like what objects inspired nostalgia. I thought I actually thought it would be objects that inspired nostalgia, but as I was writing more and more of the story, I realized it was particular people that inspired nostalgia. So based on the person I was writing about or the person I hoped to communicate with, then I would choose my object. So it was a little bit inverse. Thank you for your question.
This animal would be great to put into the carousel, but it's a little bit like on the nose.
Cat. I kind of like this duck. I feel like that's a little bit unexpected, right? Yeah, I'll put this duck in.
So I've got a couple of practical questions.
Yeah.
What is the size of your sketch as compared to the printed version? And has any antique dealer objected to you taking a lot of photographs and not necessarily buying it?
So the first question, I draw 9x12. And I kind of make it modular. So like the edges, you can like crop it depending on how you want it to be. And I just make it that way. So it's not a headache for the publisher. And then I just send it off. So 9x12, and I actually don't know how the final print will be because Nostalgia's not out yet. I'm still making it. For your second question of, has anybody objected to photo taking? No, when I ask up front. I say, and I have proof. I'm on my phone, like, look, I'm real. Like, look at this art I'm making. And you could be part of this. But one time though, I was in a flea market with a fellow like professor, and she just wanted to film like B-roll, like film things that she can make educational videos with, you know, things to take up time and space. But she was just filming without asking permission, and she got a lot of people going like, stop that, what are you doing? We were also in a foreign country, so it was hard for her to ask. But I said, we were in Portugal. So I said, oh, how about this? Instead of you filming everything, and also it just makes us seem like the stereotypical like Chinese tourist when you do that. And that might also be why people are so antagonistic towards us, which is unfortunate. But it's like very real when you go to Europe and you're like Asian and people just assume things. Anyways, I said, how about instead of just starting to film them, you'd ask posu, which means like, can I? And then just point to your camera. And the instant she started doing that, like, can I, camera, take pictures? Not a single person disagreed. Everybody was like, yeah, sure, go ahead, because she asked permission. So I think the key thing is asking for permission. Thank you for your questions. Those were good questions.
Just as a follow-up to that question about the size that you work at, you have not then been given a page dimension for the book yet?
I'll be honest, it's really hard to get a hold of my editor. But that's sort of the case when you work in publishing and you're like the freelance artist / illustrator. You're sort of like beholden to the needs of the company. And they contact you when they need something, but when you contact them, it's not a true guarantee they will respond all the time. And so I have sent final artwork to her and I've not heard anything back. So I think that's good. As ironic as it sounds, like as much as I heard from her, it was honestly just edits to my sketches, the book signing contract, and making sure that my files weren't merged all together, that the text files could still be edited. And I was like, all right, okay.
You have your particular layout, but if your page size changes, is that going to change your boxes, you know?
Because honestly, at the end of the day, it will be like this size. So long as it like can crop a little bit like this, that's fine. And that's actually a common thing in books is just you cannot design near the spine of a book, you know, this part, because it would get folded and you wouldn't see it. So already you have this restriction in mind when you're designing for any comics. And I also think that no matter what the size, I can just like shrink the panels or not make them bigger. That would not do well for the resolution, but I can shrink them. Yeah, so it is modular. But that is such a fair question.
Yeah,
with comics, there's only like a limited space on the panels, and through often like comics, there's like a 9-panel rule to follow. So I'm just wondering, how do you determine like what panels are for like character building, what panels are for plots, and what characters just for world building? Because there's so many components of storytelling, and panels are just so restricted.
That's a good question. Unfortunately, there's no one formula for it. So I actually don't know this 9-panel rule. I think that a comic can be whatever you wish it to be. So if you want to make it 100 panels, would I recommend it? No, but you could, right? But also like when to have like character development, when to have world building, when to blah, blah, blah. Like that's just writing a story. How do you sense when is feeling good, when it doesn't feel good? I mean, I think some general questions you can ask yourself is, who is your character? What do they need to do? Why do they need to do it? And how do they change at the end? And it's actually really hard to answer those like seemingly basic questions. I had an author friend, I was just telling my partner about this, but I have an author friend who was making a story about like a really anguished like female boxer. And her editor's like, why is she so sad? And the author was like, why don't you get it? But it's a fair question to ask. There wasn't enough hints to like sort of pick up and piece together the story behind why is she so sad? It's a basic question, but it can be pretty hard to answer depending on the story you're writing. But some other things that you could do is have peer readers, have somebody else read your story and say, oh, it's kind of boring here. Maybe introduce something here, or oh, this character, I don't understand why they're here. How about you make them like, maybe they're a thief or a bandit, and that makes sense in the story, like other people's suggestions. I just talked about how comics is basically about autonomy over your story, but it's also a balance. Like, how do you consider your own desires with what other people perceive? So again, balance. Having other people read your work helps a lot. Does that answer your question? Yes. Awesome. Thank you for your question. I think what's really tough about this is I'm trying to draw this duck from a different point of view. So I kind of have to like visualize it and then remind myself what it's going to look like. But that's okay, because I'll just do it.
I think culturally, we were talking yesterday about this called Clam, and I think some of their work, I know they're panelists, right? So, and I find that that perhaps like a tradition of manga, you know, from I think it was Providence, that was like very regimented, and then sort of break out of that. And I'm wondering if that sort of tradition of layout has really changed over time. Been influenced with some printmaking technologies.
Ooh, wait, I actually have a great answer for that, except I have approximate knowledge of it. So not exact names or dates. But I know that in American comics, there was like a DC or a Marvel comic, don't remember which one, where at first with DC and Marvel comics, the writers wrote a bunch of things and they said, okay, you as an artist, you need to fit all that writing in, and we're not going to work together. They worked very much separately. But there was this particular comics artist, and I can't remember his name, who made a very controversial story about like an ex-Nazi trying to live incognito and trying not to get discovered for his like crimes. But he like really vouched for full autonomy over that comic. He was like, I want to write it and draw it. And eventually he got his way. He wrote and drew it. And there was like a really groundbreaking sequence of panels in that comic where the guy is like running and he feels like he's going to get caught, and he like falls down the stairs. And so usually with the writer, they say, oh, your character needs to say this and then say that, and then this needs to happen. You need to draw it accordingly. But what this person did was made it cinematic. So not only was it sort of like dialogue after dialogue, but it was also like millisecond after millisecond. He slowed time down with the paneling. And unfortunately, that comic did not become very popular because of a lot of circumstances not within his control. But it became like later on rediscovered by artists, and they said, oh, that's some really cool paneling. That was truly like an artistic expression and a storytelling tool that could only be created outside of the restrictive publishing, process. So yes, there have been actually like iconic moments where people reconsidered paneling. I'm sure there are others in the world, but I just thought that was such a cool story. Did that answer the general question that you had, Susie? All right, awesome.
Yes, we're talking about the master rates
Yeah,
by Bernie Greenstein.
yes, thank you.
It was published in 1955, actually. It's pre-modern Marvel and DC.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's very cinematic, it's very impressive.
Oh, we have a fact checker here. Thank you.
I remember that was some years ago. I made a lecture about narrative, and we talked about this comic too. But if you go like back to Little Nemo, like in early 20th century, like Winsor McCay, he was already experimenting with panel layouts, and it was like groundbreaking from the start.
Yes.
You mentioned writers and illustrators. I'm wondering if you're ever interested in working collaboratively with somebody as opposed to, being the one that controls all in the story.
Yeah, I am interested in working collaboratively, maybe in the future. So like not currently, but I'd have to find the right partner. I think that relationship between me and whoever this partner is, whether that person is the writer or the artist, I think would be so important. So yes. Why are you interested? Hmm.
Illustrator, you see those, like, oftentimes it's like two separate roles, right? When it comes to. But I know that there are other groups that work even more collaboratively, where there are multiple people on a colorist. You have, someone that does like the
Yeah.
background.
Probably depends on the dynamic of the group, honestly. And something that would be really important is just open communication, and boundaries and delegated tasks, but room for flexibility. It's hard to work with people, but it can be very, very, very rewarding. So here I've decided that this duck is not going to fit in a Ferris wheel, which, I was not beholden to the thought of a Ferris wheel anyways. I'll have the Ferris wheel be in the back and then this duck as a character.
One from Zoom. Janet Clark, can you comment on how AI is affecting your work and teaching?
I think AI is still relatively new, so I haven't seen it too much in my classroom, though I have certainly gotten questions of students. So some of like the opening lessons I have for basic drawing, painting classes is how do you gather references? How do you research? How do you draw something based on that research? And then I've had students say, well, can we use AI as research and reference? And I say no for the first few weeks. But then as it goes on, I also kind of instill in them this idea that what if somebody takes AI from you? What if somebody takes away this tool entirely? Are you going to just be left in the dark and you don't know what to do? That's not the goal here. The goal here is to become resourceful. The goal is to look at different avenues of potential. So if all of your reference is AI and somebody takes that away from you, you're doomed. But when you look at AI as like a tool in the world and you look to the world for different resources, I think that's where the true skill is. So eventually, I do start off with saying, okay, no AI, but then as it goes on, people start to understand like the true meaning behind my lessons. I think that AI would actually hinder them from truly understanding the lessons. How do you become resourceful? And how do you utilize the tools in the world? And how do you look to the world for reference? So, I mean, to answer your question, AI is not bothering me too much yet, but I'm curious about it, and with anything that's new, people will be wary of it, and it's valid that I also feel wary about it. But I think it's also important to understand it and eventually not be ambitious, but be resourceful about it as well. Does that answer that question? Thank you for that question.
Thank you for that very scary question.
She says, thank you. We are all curious and explorative.
Yeah, you could also ask more questions, or if you guys are hungry, there's food. Yeah, there's food.
All right, let's say, I'm gonna try to finish this so fast.
The question, go ahead and shout it out. Actually, I still haven't.
Yeah, let me just check. Oh, so I know you mentioned, we talked about this briefly. So Kat is, and I you're teaching among the class of summer.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah, so she's teaching among the class of summer at UC. So I'm just curious about how we're organizing that, and you mentioned some of the places that you're going, what you'll be covering, you know, I'm sure like there are a number of us that are probably curious about that.
Oh yeah, for sure. So I'm teaching a manga course in Kyoto in Japan. So we're partnering with Kyoto Saika, which is a university there that has like a manga drawing major really, as well as like an animation major. It's an art school. And some really important things in the curriculum are honestly listening and observing the culture around people. So we'll have like invited editors, invited artists, invited guest speakers, and people will basically just listen and look at the processes of all of these artists. Also taking people to museums, taking them to different publishing centers, et cetera, to like understand this different world. Because I think the biggest takeaway is that you are literally in a different country. It's good to understand the country's culture. But so that's the big takeaway, just listening and observing. But the other thing is that it is an exchange with Kyoto Saika. So me and the fellow professor Eric, we will also be teaching a RISD curriculum class for the Japanese students, those that speak English. And particularly, I think there is like a different cultural way of learning arts in the different countries. I think with Japan and a lot of East Asian countries, it's a lot of just like listening to your mentors and doing what your mentors tell you because they are the masters at their craft. Makes sense. But a lot of what RISD promotes is critique. How do you be in a space with open conversation? How do you have conversations where you learn about other people's points of views and other people's input on your work? And then in turn, how do you listen critically? How do you take the information you think is helpful? How do you not take the information you don't think is as helpful? How do you parse through that information? And so I think that critique is not one that is not a skill that is as perpetuated in other schools. So that is basically the RISD side of things, the American English lessons for that class. But overall, for a lot of for some of those students, it might be their first time ever abroad. So I think a lot of that class is also how do you go to a foreign country and be open-minded and understand and learn and be part of this world. So that's another big takeaway of that class. Thank you for that question, Susie. Susie was like really actively listening because like we were just talking about this like yesterday and now it's a question today, so thank you. Yeah, I can finally tell my mom that all those years of like watching Inuyasha really paid off.
So please, just unwrap some sandwiches. They are like split up into 2 and 3. So if you want to take they're all vegetarian. Yeah, they're all vegetarian. So please come and partake. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody, so much for having me.
Did you take the session? Is it available?
It will be. I don't know if it's gonna be, it's available, but if you give an email, we can.